Today we're going to look at that big question often discussed on shoe forums. Which is best, Blake stitch or Goodyear welted? People have very strong opinions on this, and that's fine, but today I want to look at the differences between the two and maybe where did they come from originally, what was the history behind them, and let's decide on which is maybe best for you when you're picking your next pair of shoes. Where did they both come from? Actually, they were both invented in the USA. Blake stitching was invented around 1858 and Goodyear welted about 10 years afterwards. It was patented in 1875. They both came about because industrialization and introduction of factories, and shoe factory owners wanted a way to make shoes faster and keep the quality up and keep the cost down. So these stitching machines were invented to help with that. Are they still relevant today? Well, most shoes in the world, they don't use stitches at all. They use glue to attach the sole to the upper, and that's fine for most shoes. But stitching is good in that it's a traditional technique, and we all like a bit of tradition in our lives. But also the stitches can be cut and the shoe separated from the sole, and you can put a new sole on, which is really nice if you've got a beautiful pair of shoes and you've worn out the soles. You love the shoes but you want to prolong the life. It's really easy with either Blake stitched or Goodyear welted to put a new sole on, so it extends the life of the shoe. So they're both similar but they're different, and the similarity is that clearly they're both stitching techniques, so they're both ways of attaching the shoe upper, the bit you really see, to the sole of the shoe. The difference comes with Blake stitching. There is basically a single stitch and it goes right through the sole and into the upper and it's one stitch. The Goodyear welt has a different idea behind it. It has two stitches. So one stitch attaches the upper to something called the welt, and then a second stitch attaches the welt to the sole of the shoe. So why did they do this? The idea originally, think back to the mid 1800s, it was leather soles. There weren't any synthetic soles at that point. If you lived in England or America where the weather's quite wet, you don't want to get wet feet. So the idea of the welt was if any rain sort of soaked up the first stitch into the welt, it wouldn't then be able to transfer across and then up the second stitch to where your foot is, so you would keep your foot nice and dry. It's a great idea, and it was, it was a very revolutionary idea at that point. It made a lot of sense. So is it still relevant to use a welt? We think today less so, because there's a few reasons. Blake stitching developed further. The machinery became more advanced with thinner needles and became Blake rapid. The thinner needles meant smaller holes, less ability for the water to wick up. Also, synthetic threads were invented and they didn't allow the water to wick up so much, so less of an issue. Also, then people moved towards rubber sole shoes or part rubber soles. So the combination of rubber, synthetic threads, all helped to make Blake stitch shoes just as good in most cases. So why wouldn't you use a welt all the time? Well, the welt actually sticks out a little bit and you can see it from above and from the side more than with a Blake stitch shoe. Maybe that doesn't worry you. With others, they want a sleeker, more discreet look, more like a classic European styling. Using a welt will also add to the cost because it's an extra step in the manufacturing process, and cost always gets transferred into the price you have to pay. So it makes the shoes a little bit more expensive. If you see here in this diagram the construction of the welted shoe, it's a little bit thicker than the Blake stitched equivalent. So that thickness adds a bit of rigidity and less flexibility to the shoe, that some people would say Blake stitch shoes are a little bit more flexible and a little bit more comfortable straight out of the box. In either case, you can get them resoled, as we've said. You can go to most cobblers in the high street, or there are mail order specialists, and you can get your shoes resoled, whether it's Blake or Goodyear, quite easily these days. When would Goodyear welted be best? I would say if you really like a leather soled shoe and maybe you're doing a lot of miles in them every day, and maybe you live in an inclement climate such as here in the UK or the USA, if you're doing a lot of miles and it's a bit wet and you like leather, then Goodyear probably does have the edge. Still a good idea, like it always was. If, however, you prefer your shoes a little bit more discreet, maybe you're quite happy to have a bit of a rubber sole or a part rubber sole, and maybe you're wearing the shoes for best and you're not wearing them day in, day out, then I think then Blake Stitch is easily as good as Goodyear. So I would go Blake Stitch if I wanted the shoe to be more discreet in the styling. I was looking for a little bit of flexibility and comfort. So finally, the big question is, which is better? Well, the truth is there is no best in this case. I would say that if I was buying shoes about 80 years ago, before rubber soles and before synthetic threads, perhaps I would have gone Goodyear welted, especially living in the UK. It's very traditional, it's more water resistant. But as I've said, now with Blake stitching, it's pretty much on a par in terms of water resistance. And I think really what it comes down to is, what do you like the look of? If you like the look of the welt, which some people do, it's a very British look, that's fine. If you don't like the look of that welt, if you want it to be more discreet, you don't want to really look at the sole too much, then Blake stitching obviously aesthetically is the way to go. At the end of the day, they're both great traditional techniques which have been around 150 years, so you can't really go too far wrong with each of them. Both of them are far better than a glued sole. You can get them repaired, there's pros and cons as we've said, but really at the end of the day today the choice is yours. I would say look at the shoe first, and if you like the look of a welted shoe, fine, go for that. If you like the look of a Blake stitch shoe, I'd go with that. You want it to last a long time, and really pick the shoe that you love, not the one that makes more sense on a technical basis. So that would be my final bit of advice. With Thomas Bird, because of the aesthetic we were going for with European styling, and we're not really going for the waterproof walking through puddles market, let's say, we decided to go the Blake stitch route, which is very Italian and European based, and it suits the look that we were going for. But if you like the Goodyear look, that's fine. There's many great British manufacturers still using Goodyear welted techniques, but ourselves, we've gone for Blake stitched. So, but really the choice is yours at the end of the day. Either are fine.